At 41, Rachel Bennett had reached the kind of breaking point no farmer likes to admit. 2 dead bee colonies, unpaid bills, and barely enough money left to choose between groceries and keeping the rest of her apiary alive. Maple Ridge Homestead was only 7 stubborn acres in Yancey County, North Carolina. But after her divorce, it became the one thing she refused to lose. Her 16-year-old son, Caleb, had started taking extra shifts after school at the feed store, slipping part of his paycheck toward groceries, even though Rachel told him not to. That hurt worse than the empty hive boxes behind the barn. One morning, while clearing a back corner under warped boards and dust-blackened tarps, she found something she had not seen in years. A hollow, weathered log hive once used by her late great-uncle Walter Green. The wood was split, gray with age, and useless by every modern standard she had been taught to trust. Hank Dalton, a veteran beekeeper who had spent decades working with Langstroth hives, took one look and told her what she already feared. She could not pull frames, inspect brood, check the queen, or monitor disease properly. If the colony weakened, she might not know until it was too late. Rachel knew he was right, but a replacement setup cost more than she could spare, and something about Walter's old hive would not let her drag it to the burn pile. She did not believe the past was automatically wiser. She did not think an old log could magically save her farm. What she had was desperation, curiosity, and the memory of a man who had kept bees on that same hillside long before she was born. So Rachel made a decision that looked foolish from the outside. She would clean the old hive, repair what she could, and find out whether the forgotten method alone was worthless, or whether it was hiding a lesson modern equipment had made far too easy to ignore. But the real surprise was not whether Walter's old hive could still hold bees. It was what Rachel would be forced to notice once she could no longer rely on opening a box for answers. She spent the next several evenings reading about the hollow log hives once used across the Appalachian South, especially sections of black gum and other naturally hollow trees that could be cut, capped, and turned into simple bee homes with almost no purchased equipment. Inside, the bees built natural comb directly against the cavity walls, just as they would inside a hollow tree. The design was cheap, practical, and rooted in necessity, but Rachel quickly understood why it had disappeared from serious beekeeping. There were no removable frames to lift. She could not easily inspect brood, judge the queen's laying pattern, check food stores, spot disease early, or separate healthy comb from trouble. Modern Langstroth hives had replaced bee gums for good reasons, and Rachel had no intention of pretending otherwise. She still trusted her remaining frame hives, still believed in inspection, and still knew that modern management gave beekeepers information an old, hollow log could never provide. That was exactly what made Walter's hive interesting. If earlier beekeepers could not constantly look inside, then what had they learned to watch outside? Rachel repaired the split wood, cleared decades of debris, patched the weathered top, and carried the heavy hive down toward the creek where Walter had once kept his bees. She set it on blocks above the damp ground, gave it a slight forward tilt for drainage, and stood back beneath the trees. For the first time, she stopped asking whether the old hive was better. The better question was harder. What had modern equipment made so convenient that she had slowly stopped paying attention to it every day? But just when Rachel began to think the old hive might prove everyone wrong, the mountain weather turned and nearly buried the experiment before it had a chance to teach her anything. In late spring, Caleb spotted a wild swarm hanging from a low branch near the creek, thousands of bees packed into a trembling, dark cluster above the water. Rachel knew buying a package of bees and a new queen was out of the question, so she moved quickly. Using the simplest method she remembered from Walter's stories, she clipped the branch, lowered it near the entrance, and let the swarm settle into the hollow cavity on its own. By the next morning, bees were flying in steady lines. Within days, workers returned with bright pollen packed on their legs, and the old log seemed alive again. Hank Dalton heard about it and laughed that Rachel had somehow managed to find free bees for a free hive. For nearly 3 weeks, even Rachel began to wonder whether the experiment might work. Then a cold Appalachian rain settled over Yancey County. Night temperatures dropped, clouds hung low over the ridge, and the spring bloom slowed almost overnight. The change at the hive was immediate. Morning traffic thinned, fewer workers returned with pollen. By the end of the week, the entrance that had been humming with life looked almost abandoned. Rachel stood in the wet grass before sunrise, staring at the dark opening and feeling every weakness of the design at once. She couldn't pull a frame. She couldn't check brood. She could not see whether the queen was laying, whether stores were running low, or whether disease had taken hold. All she had was silence and guesswork. For the first time, Hank's warning no longer sounded cynical. It sounded practical. Rachel began to believe the hive had failed, and with it, the last excuse she had for keeping Walter's old method alive. But one question would not leave her alone. Had the primitive hive betrayed her? Or had she made a mistake before the bees moved in? But the answer Rachel needed was not inside the hollow log at all. It was buried in a small, stained notebook Walter Green had carried through these same woods decades earlier. She found it tucked inside an old cabinet in the barn, its pages crowded with dates, arrows, temperatures, and short observations written in faded pencil. At first, Rachel expected records about queens, honey, or colony strength. Instead, Walter had written about wind direction, nighttime lows, first morning flight, hours of shade, creek conditions, blooming plants, pollen color, and the direction returning bees approached the yard. He had been studying the land as carefully as the hive. Rachel began copying the habit. Each morning before work, she stood near the creek with a notebook of her own and recorded when the first bees appeared, where they flew, what was flowering, how long the old hive remained in shadow, and how cold the creek bottom felt compared with the higher ground near her modern hives. For several days, the notes seemed meaningless. Then, a pattern emerged. On clear nights, cold air drained down the slope and settled along the creek bottom. The hollow hive sat directly in that pocket. Worse, the landscape Walter had known was no longer the same. Trees that had once been young now formed a dense canopy that blocked early sunlight, while an old line of shrubs that had protected the site from valley winds had disappeared years ago. Rachel finally understood what she had done wrong. She had treated Walter's old location like a recipe, assuming that because it worked once, it should work forever. But farms do not stand still. Trees grow, wind breaks vanish, water paths shift, pastures change, shade deepens. A place that once protected bees can become cold, damp, or exposed decades later. Walter had not chosen that creekside yard because tradition told him to. He had chosen it because he had been reading the conditions around it. Rachel had copied his location, but not his reasoning. And that realization changed the experiment completely, because for the first time, she stopped asking what was wrong with the hive and started asking what had changed in the world surrounding it. But the most important change Rachel made was surprisingly small. She moved the hive 60 feet uphill, and that short distance began rewriting everything she thought she understood. The new site caught the first warmth of morning sun, slipped into shade during the hottest part of the afternoon, and sat behind enough brush and cedar to break the wind that had been cutting down the creek. Cold air could drain past instead of settling around the hive, while water remained close and forage stretched in every direction. Rachel did not open the log. She did not change the bees, add feed, replace the queen, or introduce expensive equipment. She changed only the place where the colony lived. For the first few days, nothing dramatic happened. Then the entrance began to wake up. A handful of workers became dozens. Returning bees arrived with yellow and cream-colored pollen packed against their legs, and Rachel started counting them the way Walter once had. She marked their flight directions and walked the property afterward, discovering blackberry patches along the fence, clover in the pasture, sourwood near the woods, and later, goldenrod beginning to build along the field edges. By July, her notebook had become more than an inspection log. Rachel sketched a simple bee yard map connecting morning sun to water, wind protection to shade, and each season of bloom to the direction the bees were flying. The colony was no longer just a box on the farm. It sat inside a network of temperature, shelter, moisture, and food. By early August, the hollow log hive looked more active from the outside than either of her remaining modern colonies. Rachel still refused to call it proof that the old hive was better. What she had proved was simpler and more useful. Sometimes the fastest way to improve what happens inside a hive is to stop staring at the hive and start reading the land around it. But the real test came when Rachel's strange little experiment stopped being a private curiosity, and the rest of the county began losing bees. By late August, conversations at Dalton Farm and apiary supply had changed from jokes about Rachel's hollow log to uneasy reports of weakening colonies. No one could point to a single cause. Some yards were running short on forage after weeks of heat. Others were fighting heavy mite pressure, failing queens, poor nutrition, or colonies that had entered the late summer dearth already too weak. Hank Dalton lost several hives in a matter of weeks, and even Rachel's 2 remaining Langstroth colonies began showing thinner traffic at the entrances. Yet the hollow log colony uphill kept flying hard from morning into the afternoon. Rachel refused to call that proof that the old hive had protected them. She knew better. She still could not inspect brood, verify queen health, or see what was happening inside the comb. Instead, she opened Walter's notebook beside her own and followed the evidence she could actually measure. The pasture around her modern hives had faded early, with clover mostly gone and the field edges drying brown. But the bees from the relocated log were still flying toward woodland margins where goldenrod, late blackberry, and scattered wild blooms continued producing forage. The difference was not a miracle hidden in old wood. It was the landscape surrounding the colony, and Rachel had noticed it because she had been forced to watch. A few days later, Hank pulled into Maple Ridge and walked toward her without the grin he usually wore. He looked at the old hive, then at Rachel, and asked the question she had never expected to hear from him. "What did you do differently?" Rachel did not point to the log. She handed him the notebook. Months earlier, Hank had the experience and Rachel had desperation. Now Hank still had the experience, but Rachel had something he had never thought to collect. A daily record of the land, the weather, the forage, and the bees responding to all of it. And suddenly, Hank wanted to understand. But what happened next mattered far more than whether one strange hive survived, because Rachel's lesson was about to spread beyond Maple Ridge. Hank began using her observation method in his own bee yard, and within days he noticed something he had overlooked for years. Several hives sat in a low spot where cold air settled overnight and late summer forage was thin. 46. Word traveled quickly. At first, local beekeepers came to Rachel's farm to see the woman keeping bees inside an old hollow log. But once they opened her notebooks, their questions changed. Soon they were asking about morning sun, wind, shade, pollen traffic, seasonal bloom gaps, and cold pockets along creek bottoms. By October, Rachel was invited to speak at a regional beekeeping meeting. Her message was simple. She did not tell anyone to abandon Langstroth hives. She told them to inspect brood, monitor mites, and manage queens. But before lifting a frame, she asked them to read the land around the colony first. A farmer's market began carrying Rachel's honey. The extra income did not make her rich, but it helped replace worn equipment, cover a few bills, and ease the pressure Caleb had been trying to carry. Then, one cool evening in late October, Caleb sat beside her near the old hive and watched the last bees return through fading light. After months of keeping his distance, he finally asked, "Can you teach me how you know where they're going?" Rachel showed him how to watch flight direction, pollen color, and the changing flowers beyond the fence. In that quiet moment, Walter's knowledge passed to Rachel, and Rachel passed it to Caleb. The old hive had never been the miracle. Attention was. If this story reminded you that progress should never erase the wisdom of observation, subscribe to Solace Farm Stories and tell us in the comments, what old farming lesson from your family is still worth remembering?